Hey, everybody, we have a great one today, and I mean it. You know, sometimes I say we have a great one for a change. That's a joke, okay? But this one is really, really great. This is Marc Elias, who is the election lawyer for the Democratic Party. And we are going to have a weird election, probably, because Trump's the president is one, and also because we're at this moment and we don't know what November is going to look like. So I talked to Marc Elias mainly about that, and about trying to make sure that we have an election, and we will. We have to. Marc Elias is the lawyer, really, for the Democratic Party. He represents me. He represents pretty much, I think, every member of the U.S. Senate. He was the guy who ran my recount, which was a 9-month, most of that just a legal battle. I think you're going to really, really enjoy this interview. We have an election coming up in November, the first Tuesday after the first Monday. That's when you have to have this election. We will have it. There's just a lot of questions about, let's say, the pandemic is back in November. How are we going to do this? How are we going to make sure that people can vote absentee? How are we going to make sure that it's fair? You know, how are we going to make sure that there are enough polls open for people to vote? How are we going to do early voting so that we can spread people out? This is a very, very important, I think, interview. I don't know if you heard, this is a couple weeks ago now, I guess. Trump stopped these White House briefings, at least temporarily, because he talked about injecting disinfectant in your bodies. And remember, he said at the CDC that he really knows this stuff, that everyone all the doctors and scientists at the CDC were amazed at how well he understood everything. And he had to stop after embarrassing himself so badly. And that takes a lot for him to get embarrassed or to understand, have people tell him he embarrassed himself, and for him to understand it and act on it. But anyway, Dr. Birx, in one of those press conferences, was asked about Georgia opening and the tattoo parlors and the massage parlors and getting, barbershops. And she was asked, like, how are they going to maintain social distancing when you're getting a haircut or a massage or a tattoo? Instead of saying, you can't. You can't. Here's what she said.
If there's a way that people can social distance and do those things, then they can do those things. I don't know how, but people are very creative.
Okay. You can't take a pass on that one. You have to say, you can't do it. You can't get a haircut. No one invented the 6-foot scissors. And a tattoo artist that would, again, I guess you could invent something. Now, I'm sheltering in place, and I was going a little stir crazy. So when Georgia opened, I drove down there. I went to Dalton, Georgia, and I got a haircut, a massage, and tattoo all at the same time. The tattoo I got is a drawing of that, and it's really commemorating this period of time on my my arm, and I didn't do that. Let's see. So we do not have a coherent national approach to this whole thing, and normally that would come from a coherent president. We just don't have that. So it's going to have to come, I think, from Congress, and by that I mean the House, because McConnell has no interest in that. So we need hearings. That's one of the things I've been writing about, is how we need to have hearings. One of the things we need to have hearings on right away is testing. This is ridiculous that we do not have a national approach to testing. Now, Andy Slavitt, who's been my guest several times, he and Scott Gottlieb, who is the former, under Trump, the head of the FDA, have put together a plan that really makes a lot of sense. You know, the current package, last package had $25 billion for testing, but there were no hearings about it. This is what Slavitt and Gottlieb have put together. It would cost $46.5 billion. $12 billion would expand the contact tracing workforce. These are people, they don't need a lot of training. It's 180,000 people. So that's 180,000 jobs. And Larry Brilliant is part of this group that came up with this. Larry Brilliant is going to be my guest next week. He is one of the people who eradicated smallpox from the face of this earth. The way they did it was manpower. They literally went door to door. 100,000 people in India when they eradicated it. They just found the last case, and that was it. They isolated people, and they got rid of smallpox. We're not going to get rid of this, but we need to find people, isolate them, and do this tracking. Now, there's $4.5 billion in this plan to use vacant hotels so that infected people can self-isolate. Now, that, you know what? That's, hotels are hurting. This is $4.5 billion for hotels. And these people who self-isolate would get $50 a day to voluntarily self-isolate. It's about $50 a day is like what you get for jury duty. 18 months of this, of offering income support for people who are self-isolating because they've been tested positive. This is how we have to approach this. And people are going, well, $46.5 billion. We will make up for that in economic activity because we'll be able to get going faster if we do this right. We would have been able to get going faster, would open up faster if we had done this from the very beginning. And if the president and his supporters are going to start blaming Democrats for wanting to shut things down, he's the one to blame. He's the one to blame for this. He's the one to blame for the enormous costs this has had to our economy and for all the deaths. Someone said to me, I was doing a pre-interview for an MSNBC thing, and the person I was talking to said to me, what do you think about people who say, well, you know, at least it's old people. You know, they're old and it's the last few years of their life, so it's no big deal. And my response was, well, yeah, that's kind of a terrible thing to say, but think about this. What if instead of old people, this was hitting primarily little kids? How crushed would we be? So that's a real blessing. I'm sheltered in place, and I see my two grandchildren, two of my four, thank God, and they're 6 and 3. And we have lost a couple little kids. I think about stuff like that. You can tell I'm really cheery. Over the last number of weeks, we have seen a number of protests across the nation calling for governors and local officials to lift the stay-in-place orders. Polling shows that a pretty sizable majority of Americans think that would be dangerous. Certainly a huge majority of epidemiologists. But a number of Trump supporters want to see these orders dropped and get people back to work. And one of them is my first guest, former Major League pitcher Curt Schilling, who now hosts an online radio show for Breitbart. And he joins me by phone from his home in Scottsdale, Arizona. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Schilling.
You can call me Curt, Al.
Well, I didn't say you could call me Al.
So it's going to be like that, huh?
I'm sorry, that was just a joke.
Really? No wonder you failed as a comedian.
Okay, Curt.
Call me Mr. Schilling.
Fine. Mr. Schilling, some of my listeners probably don't know that you won 3 World Series rings.
I think they all know that, Al.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, fine.
Well, why don't we just get right to the idea that you broached on your Breitbart radio show to reopen Major League Baseball?
Yeah, it's about time you got to it. Look, baseball is America's game. And what better way to say that America is back than to reopen Major League Baseball?
Sure, but the commissioner...
Let me finish, Mr. Franken. I'm well aware that the commissioner has decided not to reopen. So here's my idea. And I've worked a lot on this since I first talked about it on my Breitbart show.
Okay, go ahead.
I've already gotten over 200 right-wing Major League ball players to play baseball starting next week in my, what I'm calling, Curt Schilling's Freedom League.
Freedom League.
Curt Schilling's Freedom League.
Right. Can you just give us some names of the players?
And give you a scoop? No way. But let me tell you, we have some of the best white Major League ball players in baseball.
So it's an all-white league?
No, of course not. Look, this is going to be a fun league, okay? It's going to be entertainment, okay? And we will have an all-black team, the Memphis Mud Hens, made up of black guys from AA ball who just want a chance to play in the majors and get badly beaten by the all-white teams in the league.
Any Hispanic players?
No, and no Muslims either. And Muslims aren't allowed in the stands.
Wait, so this isn't just for TV? People are going to be in the stands?
Absolutely. And no social distancing.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. There will be folks in the stands who are infected with the virus and don't know it, who will infect others at the game.
That's why I called it Curt Schilling's Freedom League. Everybody who goes to the games will get a red Curt Schilling's Freedom League baseball cap that they will be required to wear whenever they're in public so that left-wing jerks like you will have the freedom to steer clear of them.
Okay, one last question. Have you talked to President Trump about this?
Yes, and he will be throwing out the first pitch on May 8th when the Pensacola Yahoos host the Oklahoma Blitzkrieg. Should be a good time.
Oh, well, thank you, Mr. Schilling.
You can call me Curt.
Curt.
Shalom.
Well, let's keep an eye on that. Okay, let's cheer things up here. Cheer things up. I got a great one today with Marc Elias. Great guy. I know. You're going to love this. I am so pleased to have with me today Marc Elias with law firm Perkins Coie, which is the premier law firm for the Democratic Party, representing the party itself, virtually every Democratic U.S. senator, tons of House members, governors. Now, Marc, tell us what you do. You're a lawyer at the firm, right?
I am indeed.
Now, your parents must be very proud.
My parents were very proud. My brother and I were both lawyers, and I think they would have wished we had gone into finance, but we're doing okay.
And that, of course, means you went to law school, right?
I did. I went to law school at Duke University in North Carolina.
The law school alma mater of Richard Nixon.
It is indeed, and also Ken Starr. So I'm trying to make up for that every day.
Okay. And because we're both sheltered in place, we're obviously not doing this face to face. So could you give me some idea of what you look like?
Yeah,
It's an audio medium, and when I have a Sarah Silverman or a Malcolm Nance on, people have some picture in their head, right? So would you mind describing yourself?
Yeah. So I'm 6'5". I am 51 years old, and I look like a lawyer.
And you're much slimmer than when you did the recount.
I am. I lost between 75 and 100 pounds. I am slimmer, I am fitter, and I am ready for action.
Great, because I was very worried about you during, as I think the listeners have gathered by now, Marc and I are very, very good friends. And Marc is my lawyer and has been since 2008 when I ran for the Senate and clobbered Norm Coleman in the narrowest clobbering in history, right?
Yes, but we oftentimes say that if that you don't want to spend more money than is necessary to win. So if you win by 10 points, then you probably put too much into it. So you put just enough into that race to get a victory.
And just enough into the recount. Speaking of which, how is the Al Franken wing of Perkins Coie?
we're currently closed, or not the firm closed, but we're currently, the offices are closed, so we're all working remotely. But I am in the Al Franken office of my house.
Okay, and it was all incredibly well worth it. You did an amazing job. How many votes did I win by?
Just a bit over 300.
312.
Yeah, 312.
I don't know why it sticks in my head.
Yeah.
Clearly, after the initial recount was over in January, I could have been seated with the rest of my colleagues from that class. Norm Coleman immediately conceded, right?
He did not. I have to say that the Minnesota Press Corps was quite forgiving of former Senator Coleman, because he didn't concede in December. He didn't concede in January or February or March or April or May.
No, there was a trial, or what do you call it? An election contest.
Correct.
In court, and that's where I really, really got to know you, because you were, well, all during the recount. And so we had that, and that ended when? In March?
Well, the trial ended in March, but as you recall, we went to the state Supreme Court because Norm Coleman then didn't concede after the trial.
Basically, the Republicans did everything to delay my being seated, because I was the 60th. I ended up being the 60th vote. And in Minnesota, the law is that the whole process of the recount has to proceed, all the legal process, including the Supreme Court has to sign off before I was allowed to be seated. Hence the delay, because with other state laws, I could have been seated right away, right?
That's correct. In most states, you would have been seated pending the outcome of the election contest.
Harry wanted to try to seat me.
The idea was floated that when they seat the Senate, seat new members, they do it in a particular order. But I don't know if it's by state or alphabetically, but there is a process by which they do it. If we had altered that order and had seated the right number of Democrats first, and there was a way to do that. Again, I don't remember exactly how it works, whether it's by state or alphabetical or whatever, but there was a point in the process that if we followed that process, that normal process, there was a point at which Democrats would essentially have either 60 or 66, whatever the number of votes they would need.
The 2/3 of those who'd been sworn in would have been able to vote me.
Correct. Exactly.
I said no to that because I told you I'd like to be reelected.
And I think I said to you, reelection is not my business. My business is getting you seated the first time. Then you'll worry about reelection.
That's right. My instinct was, Minnesotans are pretty good government people. We're the highest percentage of vote. And I won the next one by over 200,000 votes.
And look, you were right. I mean, you were right at the time. You're right in retrospect. And before people jumped down my throat over thinking that this was worth considering, I mean, understand the time frame of this. We had at this point won the recount, and the state board of elections had declared you the winner. And the only thing we were waiting on at this point was the certificate of election, which couldn't be issued because Norm Coleman was entering into a contest, which is a relatively unusual law that Minnesota has. So, I was weighing the fact that the people of Minnesota had elected you and were entitled to 2 U.S. senators.
And in most states, I would have been seated.
In almost, at the time, I think it was literally every state. I think Minnesota was unique at that point. Maybe someone's going to correct that and say there was 1 or 2 others. But Minnesota's rule is decidedly not normal in this regard. And so, my view was not that you'd get seated and the contest would go away, but that you'd be seated pending the outcome of the contest. And then at that point, if there had to be a change, there'd be a change. But it was pretty clear to me that you were going to be the ultimate winner. And there was President Obama was coming into his first term, and it seemed important that there be a full complement of senators.
Yeah, and we would have had 60 a lot sooner. Yeah, it would have been nice to have my vote, and it would have been easier to pass the stimulus and those kinds of things. Well, look, I'd like to get back to stories about the recount just for my entertainment, but I do want to get to the 2020 election, and that's really why it's so important to have you here. This will be our first presidential election during a pandemic in a long time. 1918 was a midterm.
Correct. So this is definitely the first election that we have had in our lifetimes during a pandemic. And as you say, the first presidential election ever in the midst of a pandemic. And also, it's the first election since 1982 where the Republican National Committee has not been under a court-ordered consent decree not to engage in ballot security, poll monitoring, or voter suppression. So in 1981, there was a very close election for governor in New Jersey. The Republican candidate won by fewer than 2,000 votes, which I realize by your standards would be a landslide, but was quite close in that election. Interestingly, one of the chief aides for the Republican candidate who won narrowly was Roger Stone. But in any event, the Republican National Committee ran a program that year in that election where they hired off-duty police officers, but wearing their police uniforms to patrol minority areas of New Jersey and essentially try
minority means
majority Black and majority Hispanic areas in New Jersey, and essentially harass voters and suppress them from voting. That led to a court-ordered consent decree in 1982 that prohibited the Republican National Committee from engaging in those tactics or being involved in ballot security or poll monitoring programs. That consent decree expired in December of 2016. So this is the first election cycle in which the Republican National Committee will be allowed to once again be back in the business of engaging in ballot security measures, as they call them, or as I refer to it as voter suppression. That's something to worry about. And then obviously on top of that, we have the pandemic, and we have the fact that the President of the United States is regularly attacking our voting systems.
Let's first talk about the Wisconsin primary.
Okay.
That we had a few weeks ago. That was the Supreme Court taking a case on a state election and overturning a circuit court and a district court 5-4 along completely, let's say, at party lines. There's
been a lot written and talked about involving Wisconsin and the merits of the decision, whether the 5-4 decision was correct or incorrect.
And let's make it clear that this was a decision to make Wisconsin voters go out and vote during the pandemic and risk their lives.
Yeah. So just to lay the background here. So what was going on in Wisconsin was a couple of things. The first is you had the presidential preference primary, which was not in serious dispute. It was clear that Vice President Biden was going to win that. And certainly the Republican Party was not animated to engage in the tactics it did for that primary. The second thing that was going on, though, which was really what drove the Republican Party's adamant positions, was that there was a state Supreme Court justice election. So the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin is nonpartisan, but there was a clearly preferred progressive candidate by Democrats and a clearly preferred conservative candidate by Republicans. So what you really had at stake in that election was really a state contest over the state Supreme Court. I filed a lawsuit on behalf of the Wisconsin Democratic Party and the Democratic National Committee to seek to try to restructure that election, or to structure that election so that everyone could vote who wanted to in the middle of a pandemic. The Democratic governor, had called on the legislature, which is Republican controlled, to postpone the election, which would have been the most sensible thing. And everyone was calling on them to postpone the election. But the Republican legislature wouldn't postpone the election because they believed that it would benefit their candidate in the state judicial election.
Because the primary was not going to be really contested. The presidential primary wasn't going to be contested. So really the only thing on the ballot, basically, I think, was the Supreme Court justice, right?
That's right. And and the Republicans thought that because the pandemic was hitting Milwaukee harder than it was hitting the rest of the state, that it would suppress voter turnout in Milwaukee, and therefore they would win this state election. That was their operating political assumption. And in fact, we saw that whereas normally there are 180 plus in-person voting locations in Milwaukee, there were only 5 that were open for that election.
Now, who determines how many there are? I mean, who decided there were 5?
So there were only 5 because they couldn't. I mean, it was literally at the height of a pandemic, and they could not get enough poll workers to be willing to work on election day, and enough locations that were willing to open their sites on election day. So to head this off, we went to court to try to ease the rules for absentee voting, figuring, okay, we need to do something for these voters. So let's extend the deadlines for people to register to vote, to apply for absentee ballots, and let's make the rules easier for people to cast those ballots and have them counted. And the Republicans fought us tooth and nail at every stage. The Republican National Committee actually intervened as a defendant in that case. So they said, we want to be sued too, because we are afraid that the state of Wisconsin won't fight hard enough, essentially on its own, that the Republican National Committee intervened. The trial court tried to fashion a reasonable compromise. We didn't get everything we wanted, but tried to fashion a reasonable compromise. That compromise that was ordered went up to the Seventh Circuit, which is among the most conservative circuits in the country. So just so that everyone's clear, I think, I haven't done the math recently, but I believe that there are 12 Republican appointees on the Seventh Circuit and 2 Obama appointees. So this is not a walk in the park, liberal bench.
And what are they getting at this point? They're getting a thing. This is about whether to delay it?
No, this was about whether the absentee balloting process would be extended so that more people could have their votes counted. Because what we knew was that the Postal Service was just bogged down, and people were not even getting their absentee ballots delivered to them in time to vote them and have them returned to the state in the normal deadline that the state has, which is 8 p.m. on election night.
So you're basically trying to give people during this pandemic the choice of voting by mail.
Correct.
Okay. That seems to make a lot of sense,
yeah,
right?
Right. Not that controversial. And like I said, it was ultimately the trial court took steps to try to do that, and the conservative Seventh Circuit approved of almost all those steps. So at this point, the Republican National Committee appealed that to the U.S. Supreme Court. And to me, this is the most disturbing part of what happened next. The Supreme Court gets a ton of applications for stay petitions. I mean, every death penalty case goes to them on a stay petition. dozens and dozens per month go to the Supreme Court for emergency stay petitions. And as you know, and as your audience knows, the Supreme Court acts on a very, very small number of cases that come before them because they don't have to, right? They can just say, well, you know what, this has been reviewed by the lower courts and we're going to let things stand as they are.
And at this point, they're sheltered in place, right?
Yes, they were doing all this remotely over a weekend. Over a weekend. I mean, we filed our briefs over a Saturday and a Sunday for an election that was taking place on a Tuesday, where voters had already been told by the lower court and by the Seventh Circuit that relief had been granted to them. So you had voters who were relying on that. And then this is now before the U.S. Supreme Court over a weekend.
So the fact that they took it is unbelievable because this is a state matter. It's a state election.
Yeah.
And why would the Supreme Court take this since it's a state election?
So I think you put your finger on, like I said, the part that I find most distressing, which is that, so if you're the Chief Justice Roberts, and you are saying that I know who the Chief Justice is. and you are saying that there are no such things as Democratic judges or Republican judges, and that the Supreme Court and the courts need to stay out of the political thicket. Okay, here on the eve of an election over a state Supreme Court justice, right? There's no federal election really being implicated here. There's no federal interest. This is over.
Even the presidential primary is a state election because it's the state decides how to do that.
Precisely,
right?
Precisely. And it wasn't contested, right? So
well, and then there's that too. But I'm just trying to think of the law here.
Sure.
Because,
and so
I didn't go to law school, but I played one in a sketch.
Right. So this arrives at the court over the weekend before the election. It's already been ruled on by the trial court and by a conservative Seventh Circuit. And the case is literally captioned Republican National Committee versus Democratic National Committee. Okay, that's literally the caption of the case in front of the Supreme Court. And instead of just passing and saying, you know what, we don't need to weigh in on this one. It involves a state-run election in the middle of a pandemic. This has been looked at by a trial court. This has been looked at by a court of appeals. This is obviously a dispute between two political parties. Let's just let this one go. Instead of doing that, the Supreme Court on a Monday night before a Tuesday election issues a 5-4 decision in which the conservative justices essentially roll back some of the relief that had been given to voters and that voters had relied on over the weekend. And I think that that's like really troubling for a lot of reasons, some having to do with the jurisprudence of how that was handled and the reasoning of how it was handled, but even more so as we look towards November and we ask ourselves, what role are the courts going to play in what will be high stakes federal elections? I don't think the Supreme Court did itself any favors in weighing in this case under these circumstances.
Well, let's talk about an election during a pandemic, how you do that, and what legal, you're the lawyer for the Democratic Party, what legal battles are you going to have to fight in the next several months?
We are going to have legal battles all throughout the country. We're already seeing legal battles all throughout the country. We're currently suing in 14 states. We have more than 20 voting lawsuits. The Republican National Committee announced that it will spend $10 million opposing voting rights in court. That's just their litigation budget for opposing voting rights in court. Then they upped it to more than $11.5 million. And most recently, they said they'll spend whatever it takes. And so we are seeing literally the Republican National Committee and state Republican parties going to federal court and state courts all around the country to make voting harder. And, think about how extraordinary that is. And ask yourself, would the Republican Party under George Bush have even done that? Like, to me, the fact that the Republican National Committee has as a stated policy that it will go to court to make voting rights harder seems to me to have broken down another norm that, has traditionally governed American politics.
I'm not so sure how much of a norm that still is. I mean, obviously it isn't, but I mean, I think for a while now, the Republican Party has part of their election strategy is suppressing votes.
100% agree. 100% agree.
Okay, so I think that's been going on for a long time.
Yep. The question, though, and really, this is, I know you're interviewing me, but this is a question to you, is do you think in 2003 that George Bush, as much as I thought he was a terrible president and fought tooth and nail on behalf of John Kerry to defeat him, do you think that George Bush would have had the Republican National Committee in 2003 state as a formal policy matter, not what they were doing on the ground, where I agree with you, they were engaged in voter suppression, but do you think they would have put out press releases saying, we are going to engage in this activity and we are going to oppose voting rights?
No, they wouldn't have done that publicly.
Yeah. So don't you think that?
I mean, they're shameless now.
But don't you think that matters, though? It matters to me not just what they do, which has always been problematic, but the fact that they are saying it.
I mean, they're saying things all the time. When Mitch McConnell says the state should go bankrupt, when he says with a sly smile, if a vacancy comes open in the Supreme Court, would the Senate put someone through this year? Yep, of course. After, of course, the whole thing about Merrick Garland was, well, it's an election year. That was February when Scalia died, early February. I think McConnell is he'll fill a vacancy until noon, January 20th, 2021, if Biden wins. If someone, God forbid, perishes, one of the justices, on January 19th, he'll call the Senate through and they'll confirm somebody.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you have seen Senator McConnell engage in, norm-breaking behavior for years now. And that has transformed the Senate, as you know, in a really negative way. And it's affected the courts in a really negative way.
Now he wants to bring the Senate back, and only really to confirm judges, I'm sure.
That seems to be his stated position.
Let's talk about the things they're going to go after, right? They're going to go after, certainly, we're going to try to make it much harder to vote by mail, right?
Yes. And that has obviously been their aim in many of these court cases. And the President of the United States has said as much, that he wants the Republican Party to make vote by mail as difficult as possible.
Now, you wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly, and I'm going to tick through some of these issues about vote by mail. You say it should be postage free or paid for by the government.
That's correct. And that's because we know that when you make individuals pay for postage to return their mail ballots, it has a dissuasive effect or a suppressive effect, both on people based on socioeconomic considerations, but also age. Young voters tend to be less reliably users of stamps than older voters.
Is that the norm, that these are postage free?
The states that do vote by mail as their rule, states like Washington, Oregon, Colorado, yes. In other states, some states do. In some states, actually, it's up to the counties. So sometimes counties or cities provide free postage. It's pretty hard for anyone to argue against free postage.
It is sort of a poll tax.
There's not really a pro-postage paid by voter position.
Well, I don't put it past them to form an AstroTurf.
Yeah, exactly.
Voters for postage on absentee ballots. Okay, postmarked on or before Election Day. So in Wisconsin, was it that they had to receive it, the mail-in ballot on Election Day? Was that part of, or that's part of the dispute between us and Republicans, right?
Yeah. So part of the dispute between us and Republicans in Wisconsin was, at what point do you cut off people's right to vote? So we know that when you require ballots to be received by Election Day rather than postmarked by Election Day, We know that that has a disproportionate negative impact on young voters and minority voters. There was just a study a few weeks ago out of Florida that looked at the question of rejected ballots. And we see a much higher level of rejections among young voters and older voters and minority voters versus white voters. And in Arizona, where we're currently suing over this particular issue, the issue of do ballots count if they're cast by election day, even if they're received afterwards, there is a 400 or 600 times more likely your ballot will be rejected due to this cutoff if you're Latino or Native American than if you're white. There are both age and race.
And that is because those groups tend to get the ballot in later.
So it's not just the timing by which they get their ballot in. The reliability of mail service varies greatly throughout the United States. There are different rates of reliability in rural areas versus urban areas. And particularly when you look at groups like Native Americans, there is less reliable mail service in parts of the Southwest among areas that are heavily Latino. The mail service is both less reliable and also will just simply take longer. So the problem with the received by rule is that, you have voters who are putting their ballots in the mail 7 to 10 days in advance, and they're still not getting in by election day. And then you have others who are getting them in the mail 2 days before election day. They are getting in.
We're a bit in the weeds,
Okay.
so I want to move along here, okay?
Yep.
Okay, I know that when you're in court,
I live in the
you
weeds.
really have to, you have to be in the weeds. Okay, so signature matching, that's a fascinating one to me because I remember during our recount, we learned that a couple of ballots had been not counted because the signature on the absentee ballot didn't match. And I remember two instances. One was an older gentleman had a stroke.
Yep.
Between when he had registered to vote and had that signature and then when he voted absentee. So his signature was different, so it was discounted. But we got that vote counted, right?
We did. It's funny because I sometimes say to people that most voting rights lawyers started by being interested in voter registration and then moved from the registration process to the voting process. I actually started as a recount lawyer and then moved backwards to the voting process. And you're exactly right. My interest and my, some would say, fixation on disenfranchising signature match laws comes from the experiences of 2008 in the recount in Minnesota, where we saw voters who had done everything right, but had their ballots rejected because untrained workers in a rush were trying to compare whether they thought a signature on a return envelope matched a signature that had been provided many years before.
Well, post-stroke, his signature was very different, so I'm not blaming the inexperienced election worker. And here's the other one. This one was funny. So there was one mismatch where this kid, he was 18 or above, but he was at home, and he had an absentee ballot, and he signed it, and his mom saw the signature and said, "What's that?" He goes, "Well, that's my signature." And she goes, "No, you're going to redo this and sign it, legibly."
Right.
And so I think he had to get another ballot or something and go back in, turn that one in, get a new thing, and then signed it so his mother would approve it. And it didn't match his signature, of course. And so we got that one counted.
What the lesson from all of that has been that states need to provide training and systems in place, but also they need to notify voters, right? If voters have their ballots rejected due to signature mismatch, the counties or the local election officials need to reach out to those voters, tell them that their ballot was rejected for this reason, and give them an opportunity to cure or to say, no, that was my ballot. Minnesota actually reformed its law after that recount to now do verification in a way that doesn't rely on signatures. So there are other ways of doing ballot verification other than signature matching, but where states use signature matching, they need to give voters an opportunity to be notified.
Let's move on. Community organizations should be permitted to help and collect and deliver ballots.
So here what we're talking about is is to collect voted sealed ballots. So this is after the voter has voted. They now have a ballot that they need to return. And what we know is that many communities, particularly, again, Native American communities in Montana, are currently suing over this restriction. We sued in Arizona over this restriction. Both Native American communities and some African American and Latino communities, because of the unreliability of the mail service and the cutoffs, their preferred method to make sure their ballot gets in on time is to have a community group collect the sealed ballots and literally drive them for delivery to the county office. It's a way to make sure that they don't miss the deadline due to the mail, or where they're in a situation where they don't have access to street mail, a way to make sure their ballots get in.
This is where the issue of voter fraud comes in, because Republicans, Kobach, for example, remember he found the 3 million votes that for Hillary.
Yes.
That commission. I mean, they just keep claiming and claiming and claiming that there's all this voter fraud. And thus far, the voter fraud I've seen in the years I've been watching this stuff is Republican voter fraud. We saw that in North Carolina.
And actually, what you've seen, to put a finer point on it, is in places like North Carolina, is not actually voter fraud, but it's election fraud, right? The voters there didn't commit fraud. The voters there were the victim of a fraud perpetrated by a Republican campaign and Republican operatives. So it's an important distinction between election fraud and voter fraud. Voter fraud, which is what Republicans claim happens, is that voters illegally vote. No one in North Carolina illegally voted. Instead, in a cynical effort to deprive the African American community of their voice in that election, Republican operatives cheated to take away those voters' rights. So it wasn't voter fraud; it was election fraud by Republicans.
How did they do that?
So what they did was they went to individual voters' houses and told them that they would help them apply for absentee ballots. And then they would either falsify the applications, the operatives, or would actually get the unvoted ballots and unsealed and fill in Republican candidates. So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's
so
right.
The voters weren't committing any fraud. The voters were being cheated.
Yeah, it was Republican election fraud, that's the only fraud I've seen. I can't remember which election it was, a number of years ago, where this group, they were going out like you can and registering people to vote.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Republicans have used this as evidence of Democratic fraud. And just because, every once in a while, somebody as a joke puts Donald Duck. And it goes in and they go like, Donald Duck registered to vote. Well, they didn't accept it. They didn't they didn't register Donald Duck. It was just on the thing. But what this group did was register people and then throw out the Democrats.
It's funny you say that about Donald Duck, because I always say you need to distinguish between three things. You need to distinguish between voter fraud, election fraud, and voter registration problems. And as you say, Donald Duck may register, but Donald Duck's not going to vote. And the thing that drives me crazy more than anything is people will say there are dead people on the voting rolls. Well, of course there are dead people on the voting rolls. The people die. Like someone dies yesterday, like their family doesn't call up the Board of Elections and say, please remove the deceased from the voter rolls, right? What happens is over time, those dead voters get removed when the death records get synced up with the voter record.
In fact, I wrote a sketch, I think, just for my own amusement, a couple of years ago, which was the premise was there's a guy in his deathbed and he's just obsessed with unregistering before he dies.
Yeah, exactly.
And his family doesn't really care about that,
yeah, exactly.
But he does.
Precisely. And the fact is that when there are people on the voter rolls who are deceased or who have moved, they don't vote. Right. So it's a problem that has to be handled administratively. But honestly, the easiest way to handle making sure we have clean voter rolls would be for states to adopt automatic voter registration. Because when you have automatic registration, people get automatically registered and then they get automatically removed. So one of the things that I've tried to argue to Republicans is that if they're worried about voter registration fraud, as inconsequential as that is, the easiest way to deal with it is to just have the state automatically register every eligible voter. And then when people become ineligible, the state will automatically deregister them. And then you never have to worry about private voter registration at all.
Let's talk about early voting just quickly, if we could. One thing they try to do is cut down the number of days, right? They've gotten rid of voting on Sunday because of souls to the polls, which is at black churches. It's been kind of a tradition to, after church, take people who want to vote, right?
Yeah, early voting is important, and more important in the day of COVID than even before, because when you let people vote on weekends, in particular, you spread out the vote over a longer period of time. You allow for greater social distancing because it is spread out over a more number of days, and it's convenient. It's convenient, obviously, for, as you say, the African American community has organized itself in many places around Sunday voting, souls to the polls. But frankly, Saturday and Sunday voting is widely popular among Democrats, Republicans, independents, black, white. And the only reasons why Republicans oppose it is because it allows more people to vote, and because, as you say, African Americans in particular make higher uses of it than whites.
Okay, let's talk about staffing at polls. Now, you said in Wisconsin, one of the issues was that's why they had only 5 polling places in Milwaukee, is that they just couldn't get enough people to man the polls. Next November, we got to make sure that we have staffing at the polling places.
Yeah, my main message to everyone listening, and to all the campaigns and nonprofit organizations, is if you want to do something to help democracy, get trained and be a poll worker. Because in 2018, 2/3 of poll workers were over the age of 60 and 25% were over the age of 70. And so we need to do things to incentivize younger people and a bigger pool of people to be available to work as poll workers on election day.
Yep, that's a good movement. We have to have a lot of polling places so that people can vote.
Yeah, and inevitably, when we don't have enough polling places, it inevitably winds up hitting the precincts that are most heavily minority. We see that time and time again, where you have a county that has, both predominantly white areas of voting and predominantly Black and Hispanic, and we see a differential in the staffing and the lines. There was actually a study done by a group of political scientists that used cell phone ping data to determine wait times, and found that African Americans on average wait 30% longer than whites when you look at predominantly Black precincts versus predominantly white precincts. And a lot of that has to
Now, are Republicans aware of this? Because so we can do something about it.
Look, the biggest thing we can do here, there's ways to litigate these cases, and that's something we're definitely looking at. But the biggest thing I can tell progressives to do is to get trained and volunteer to be a poll worker. Because if we have enough poll workers in those areas, then we'll be able to open more polls.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that seems very important.
It is.
So people listening to this podcast, do that. That's it. That's something you can do.
Yeah, and if people want to know how you do that, these trainings and recruitments are done at the county level in most states. In states like Michigan, which operates its elections at the municipal level, but it's definitely an important thing to do.
Speaking of trainings, let's go back to the recount. Every ballot was counted by hand. And there were all kinds of counting places, right? And they'd take every ballot, and we'd have someone from our team and someone from the Coleman team. We had 2, actually, at each table. And one of the first thing we did was a training to train people how to do this, right?
Correct.
And we had a huge crowd. And this is when the Coleman team was just trying to get this done because they were ahead. They were trying to rush this thing. And do you remember the chant I led?
I remember there was a chant, and I remember that you thought it was incredibly amusing.
Yes. Well, you didn't have to say that.
No, I remember there was a chant.
Here's what
I believe
it was.
What do we want? Fairness, and when do we want it?
No. This is what it is.
Okay.
Almost. What do we want? Patience. When do we want it? Now.
Patience. That's right. Yes, I did.
Patience. And then we were going, patience now, patience now, patience. That's how we got to that.
No, what I remember was that you had recruited some other people to...
Paul Begala, I think, showed up, and Bradley Whitford.
Yeah, and I remember there was just like a huge crowd of people who were super excited that you were there, and Paul, and I don't remember whether it was Bradley Whitford or who, but I remember it was for a recount training. It was a raucous event.
We needed a lot of people.
I know.
And that's why we got them there. We wanted to attract people, and it was mobbed.
It was.
And we trained those people, and it was very helpful to have all those folks.
Yes.
But I think Patience Now is brilliant.
I agree.
That was actually, it was grueling during the, I mean, I had essentially a 9-month recount.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, not essentially. I mean, it was a 9-month recount.
You're going to have a busy year, I have the feeling.
It's already a busy year. I think we've seen more voting rights litigation already in 2020 than we saw in all of 2016. So it's going to be a busy year, and we just hope for the best.
And what happens when Trump calls off the election because of the pandemic?
So he can't. So the election is set by act of Congress. And no, I get this question a lot, Al, is people think he's going to call off the election or postpone it. Federal election, general election day is set by act of Congress, and the president can't move it. A state can't move it. So we're going to have an election on November 3rd, one way or the other.
That's good, I guess. No, it is.
It is good.
What am I saying?
It just means we're going to need to be prepared. Like, there's no getting too close to the election day and being like, oh, we need another week. Like, it's going to be on November 3rd.
So first Tuesday after the first Monday.
The Tuesday following the first Monday in November, correct.
How the hell did they come up with that?
It's a law that's been on the books since 1845, so I don't know. But that is the uniform election day set by Congress pursuant to their constitutional authority.
Somebody said, you know what? Let's make it the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Somebody said that.
Yep. And it's in the law, and that's when it's going to be.
And it should be, we should vote on weekends, shouldn't we? I mean,
weekend voting would increase turnout. There is no question. The fact that we have a uniform election day that is during the week makes it much harder for people who have jobs during normal business hours to voting, which is one of the reasons why absentee voting has become so popular even before the current pandemic, because it gives people the opportunity to vote outside of that window. It's also why early voting is so popular. But yeah, if we had weekend voting, you would see increased participation across the board.
That's the battle you're fighting. You're going to be fighting all year to make sure that people get to vote in November.
Yes, indeed. That is the battle, and I wish I could say that we are assured of winning that battle, but it is every day we need to keep fighting that fight because it's really important.
Thanks for listening. My thanks to Leo Kotke for this beautiful, beautiful music, to Peter Ogburn, who is my executive producer. And I want to thank Mike Henry, who did the Curt Schilling, did the voice of Curt Schilling. I did not have Curt Schilling. I had Mike Henry. That does voices for Family Guy and the Cleveland Show. So thank you for lending your talent. And thank you for listening. And next week, Larry Brilliant, one of the very, very, very smart people who helped eradicate smallpox. Larry Brilliant. Very, 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 very smart. See you next week.